She had been awake long before the light reached the windows. The cabin always did that to her. It never let her sleep deeply. The walls were thin, the wood old, and every sound felt closer than it should. The wind moved through the trees like it had a voice, and the floor answered with soft cracks that made her open her eyes even when she was tired. She lay still, staring at the ceiling. A long line ran across one of the wooden boards, darker than the rest. She had counted it once. She used to count a lot of things when she couldn't sleep. The cracks, the nails, the slow seconds between the wind pushing and the branches settling back into place. Beside her, he slept on his back. One arm rested on his chest. His breathing was steady, calm, almost practiced. She watched it rise and fall and wondered how someone could look so peaceful while everything else felt so heavy. This had become her habit. Watching him sleep and feeling the distance grow, even though they were close enough to touch. The cabin was small. One bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchen that always smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. In the winter, the cold pressed against the walls like it wanted inside. In the summer, the heat stayed trapped thick and slow, refusing to leave. The place had character, people said. It had history. But to her, it felt like time had stopped the day they moved in. At first she thought it would be temporary. Just a few years. Save money. Figure things out. That was what he said when they first arrived. He spoke with confidence back then. His voice had been sure, his plans clear, or at least clear enough for her to believe in them. Now years had passed, and the plans were still words floating in the air, never landing anywhere solid. She slowly sat up, careful not to wake him. The bed creaked anyway. It always did. He shifted slightly but didn't open his eyes. She waited, holding her breath, then relaxed when his breathing returned to its steady rhythm. She stood and pulled on a sweater. The mornings were cold even when the season said they shouldn't be. The cabin had its own rules. It didn't care about calendars or promises. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle with water from the sink. The pipes made their usual noise, a deep groan followed by a sharp rattle. She flinched every time, expecting something to finally break. It never did. It just reminded her that everything here was old and tired, much like she felt as the kettle warmed on the stove. She leaned against the counter and looked around. The cabinets were scratched. One door hung slightly lower than the others. She had asked him to fix it more than once. He always said he would get to it. He always sounded sincere. She didn't doubt that he believed himself when he said it. The kettle whistled. She poured the water into a chipped mug and dropped a tea bag inside. Steam rose, fogging the small window above the sink. Beyond the glass, the trees stood tall and quiet. They had always been there, watching, waiting. She carried the mug to the small table and sat down. The chair wobbled. She placed her foot just right to steady it, something she had learned to do without thinking. This was her life now, adjusting, balancing, making small changes to avoid bigger problems. When they first moved to the cabin, she told herself this was what simple living looked like. Less noise, less pressure, just nature and time. She imagined peaceful mornings, shared laughter, long talks by the fire. Some of that had been real. In the beginning, back then, they worked together, fixed what they could, made plans late into the night. He talked about the land with a kind of quiet pride. He said it had potential. He never explained what he meant, but she assumed he was talking about building something bigger someday. Maybe adding rooms? Maybe selling it when the time was right. She trusted him. Trust had always come easily to her. Too easily, some might say. As time went on, his words grew fewer. His time outside grew longer. He spent hours walking the land, studying it in ways she didn't understand. Sometimes he came back with dirt on his boots and a distant look in his eyes. Like he had been somewhere far away, she asked questions. Not accusing ones. Just simple ones. "What were you working on today?" He would shrug. "Just checking things." "What things?" "Stuff that needs checking." That was usually where it ended. At first, she didn't push. Everyone needed space, she told herself. especially out here. But space had a way of turning into silence, and silence had a way of turning into walls. The tea was too hot. She wrapped both hands around the mug anyway, letting the heat sink into her skin. It was one of the few comforts the cabin still offered. From the bedroom, she heard movement. He was awake now. She waited for him to come out, but he didn't. She imagined him sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face, staring at the floor like he often did. They used to greet mornings together. Now, they seemed to take turns avoiding each other. When he finally stepped into the kitchen, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear, not anger. Something quieter. Something like disappointment that had grown comfortable. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied. He poured himself coffee, black, the way he always did. He stood by the counter, not sitting down. He never sat anymore. It was like he was always ready to leave the room. They stood there in silence. The kind that stretched, waiting for someone to fill it. She thought about saying something. About the cabinet door. About the cold nights. About how tired she was of wondering what he wasn't telling her. Instead, she said, "It's cold again." He nodded. Yeah, that was it. He took a sip of his coffee and stared out the window. His eyes lingered on the trees longer than necessary. She watched him and realized something she had been avoiding for a long time. She felt lonely even when he was standing right there. The thought scared her. Not because it was new, but because it had stayed. After he left the cabin, pulling on his jacket and boots without saying where he was going, she sat back down at the table. The door closed softly behind him. He always closed it softly. Like he didn't want to disturb the place. Or maybe he didn't want to disturb his own thoughts. She stared at the spot where he had been standing. The quiet returned quickly, filling every corner. This was the moment she felt it clearly. Not anger. Not sadness. A decision forming slowly like the first crack in ice. She didn't know when it had started. Maybe months ago. Maybe years. But the idea of leaving had stopped feeling impossible. She thought about the life she had before the cabin. It hadn't been perfect, but it had been hers. She had choices then. Noise, people, movement. Here, everything felt paused. Later that day, she went for a walk on her own. The path behind the cabin was narrow, winding through trees that blocked most of the light. She had walked it many times, usually with him. Today, she walked alone. Her boots pressed into the dirt, leaving marks that would be gone by morning. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. She stopped near a spot where the ground dipped slightly. He had spent a lot of time here lately. She didn't know why. She had asked once, jokingly, if he was hiding treasure. He smiled then. A small smile. Something like that, he said. At the time, she laughed. Now, standing there alone, the memory felt heavier. She shook her head, pushing the thought away. She was tired of guessing. Tired of reading between lines that never seemed to connect. That night, they ate dinner in silence. She cooked. He ate. The sound of silverware against plates filled the room. Finally, she spoke. Her voice surprised her with how steady it sounded. "I don't think this is working anymore." Froze. Just for a moment. Then he continued chewing, slowly. "What do you mean?" he asked. She took a breath. "I mean us, the cabin, the way we're living." He set his fork down. "We talked about this before. We talked around it," she said. "That's not the same." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What are you saying?" She looked at him. Really looked at him. The man she had loved. The man who now felt like a stranger sharing her space. "I think I need to leave." The words hung in the air. They didn't fall. They didn't break. They just existed. He studied her face. She expected anger, or pleading, or surprise. Instead, he nodded. "If that's what you want," he said. That hurt more than anything else. She went to bed that night knowing something had shifted. The cabin felt smaller than ever. The walls closer. The ceiling lowered as she lay awake, listening to the wind. She didn't know what waited beyond this place. She only knew she couldn't stay. And somewhere beneath the quiet ground, beneath the old wood and the tired silence, something waited too. Neither of them spoke of it. She left early the next morning. Before the sun had fully climbed over the trees, the sky was pale and quiet, like it was holding its breath. She stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long moment, her bag resting at her feet. The wood beneath her shoes felt familiar, worn down by years of steps. She wondered how many times she had walked in and out of this place without ever thinking it might be the last on inside. The cabin was still. He was awake, she knew that much. She could sense it. But he didn't come out. He stayed in the bedroom, giving her the space she had asked for without really asking. That hurt in a way she didn't expect. She picked up her bag and stepped outside. The door closed behind her with a soft click. No slam, no drama. Just the quiet sound of something ending. The air was cold enough to sting her face. She pulled her jacket tighter and walked toward her car. The ground was damp, and her shoes picked up bits of mud with every step. She didn't look back at the cabin, not yet. She was afraid that if she did, she might freeze right there. Caught between staying and going, the car started after a second try. The engine made a rough sound, then settled. She sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. This was real now. There was no arguing it away as she drove down the narrow road leading away from the land. The trees closed in around her, just like they always had. They didn't care that she was leaving. They didn't care about anything at all. That used to comfort her. Now it felt strange. She told herself she was doing the right thing. She repeated it in her head like a quiet promise. She needed more than silence. More than waiting. More than guessing what the future might be if someone else ever decided to share it with her. The road eventually opened up, leading to a wider stretch of pavement. Signs appeared. Then buildings. Then people. The world slowly came back into view. She stayed with a friend at first, sleeping on a couch that was too soft and waking up to sounds she had almost forgotten. Traffic, voices, doors, opening and closing. It all felt loud, but alive. People asked her questions. Why did you leave? How are you holding up? What will you do next? She gave simple answers. It just wasn't working. I'm okay. I'm figuring things out. Some nodded like they understood. Others looked at her like she was brave. She didn't feel brave. She felt tired, but it was a different kind of tired than before. This one didn't weigh her down as much. Days turned into weeks. She found a small place of her own. Nothing special, but it had heat that worked and windows that didn't rattle. She bought a second-hand table and 2 mismatched chairs. She liked them anyway. At night, she slept better than she had in years. No wind pressing against the walls. No strange sounds waking her up. Just steady, normal, quiet. Still, her thoughts wandered back to the cabin more often than she expected. She wondered how he was doing. If he noticed her absence yet? If the place felt bigger or emptier without her? She told herself it didn't matter. She had made her choice. Back at the cabin, life continued in its own slow way. He moved through the rooms without speaking. He cooked simple meals. He fixed the cabinet door she had complained about. Tightening the hinge until it sat straight for the first time in years, he spent more time outside now. Longer walks. Deeper into the land. He carried tools with him sometimes. Other times he carried nothing at all. Neighbors were rare. But a few people from nearby areas noticed more activity than usual. A truck came and went. Then another. Quiet conversations happened near the edge of the property. Nothing loud. Nothing obvious. No one asked questions. Out there, people minded their own business. One afternoon, she received a message from him. Just a short one. I hope you're settling in okay. She stared at her phone for a long time before replying, I am. I hope you're well. That was it. No memories. No regrets. No explanations. She thought that would be the end of it. But something about his calm response stayed with her. The same calm she had seen the day she left. The same lack of surprise. At the time, she thought it meant he didn't care enough to fight for her now. She wasn't so sure. She pushed the thought away. She had spent too much of her life wondering what he meant, what he knew, what he planned. She was done with that. Months passed. Her life filled with small routines, work, groceries, occasional dinners with friends. She laughed more. She spoke freely. No one looked past her when she talked. Still, every now and then, she dreamed of the cabin. Not the place itself, but the feeling of standing on land that seemed to hold secrets. She would wake up unsettled, unable to explain why, and far away, beneath the quiet trees and the repaired walls, the land began to change hands in ways no one talked about out loud. The news did not arrive all at once. It came in small pieces, the way truth often does when it has been waiting for a long time. At first, it was just a feeling, a strange weight in her chest when she heard certain words. Land, investment, remote property. She would be sitting at work, listening to people talk about things that had nothing to do with her. And suddenly her mind would drift back to the cabin without her permission. She tried to ignore it. She had learned how to do that well. But then the pieces started to connect on their own. One evening, she was scrolling through her phone, half paying attention, when an article caught her eye. It wasn't about him. It didn't mention names. It talked about a quiet region seeing sudden interest from private groups. About land that had been overlooked for decades now, being carefully evaluated. She felt her throat tighten. The map in the article showed an outline she recognized immediately. Roads she had driven on, curves she could trace from memory. She put the phone down and stared at the wall. No, she said softly. Not because she was sure, but because she hoped. The next few days, she avoided thinking about it. She focused on work. On cooking, on cleaning a space that was already clean, but the thought stayed with her. Like a low sound she couldn't tune out. When she finally allowed herself to look deeper, the answers didn't rush at her. They waited. Calm. Certain records were public if you knew where to look. Changes in ownership. New filings. Quiet partnerships. Her hands shook as she read. The cabin. The land. It was no longer just a place someone lived. It was something else now. Something people whispered about instead of talking about openly. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Memories rushed in, uninvited. Him standing by the window, looking past the trees. Long walks, he never explained. His calm the day she left, not sadness, not anger. Just acceptance. Understanding came slowly, and when it did, it hurt more than any argument they had ever had. He had known. Not everything, maybe, but enough. She replayed conversations in her head. Times she had asked what he was working on. Times he had said nothing important with a straight face. Moments she had mistaken silence for emptiness instead of restraint. Her first feeling wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Then came regret. Sharp and sudden. She didn't cry right away. She sat very still, staring at the screen until the words blurred together. Her mind kept returning to one simple fact that refused to change. She had walked away. She thought about calling him. The idea came and went 100 times in one night. What would she even say? That she knew now? That she wished she had stayed? That she wanted answers she had already missed? By morning, she knew she wouldn't call. Not yet. Across the distance, he stood in a quiet room with people who spoke carefully and moved slowly. Contracts lay on a long table. Numbers were discussed without emotion. Everything was controlled, planned. He listened more than he spoke. Someone asked him once if he had any concerns. Anyone who might come forward later. He shook his head. No, he said. And it was the truth. She had left freely, signed away what little connection she had without hesitation. He remembered how eager she was to be done, how determined she looked not to look back. He didn't feel proud of that memory. He didn't feel guilty either. He felt something closer to sadness, mixed with certainty. Life didn't wait for people to be ready. It moved when it needed to. Days passed, then weeks. The story grew quietly in places she wasn't looking. When it finally reached wider attention, it was too big to miss. The value mentioned made her stomach drop. Numbers like that didn't feel real. They felt like mistakes. like someone would correct if you waited long enough, but no correction came. She sat alone in her small apartment that night. The lights off, the city glowing through the window. Everything she had once believed about her choices shifted under the weight of new understanding. She hadn't just left a relationship. She had left a future she didn't know existed. She tried to live as if the news had not changed anything. She went to work. She answered messages. She cooked simple meals and washed dishes like she always had. From the outside, her life looked the same. From the inside, everything felt different. Knowing something and understanding it were not the same. At first, she only knew. The land had value. A lot of it. More than she had ever imagined. More than she could say out loud without feeling foolish. Understanding came later. In waves, it came when she remembered the nights she complained about the cold, and he quietly added more wood to the fire without arguing. It came when she remembered how he never seemed worried about money, even when they had very little of it. It came when she remembered how he listened more than he spoke, like someone guarding a thought that needed time. She started to see the past differently. Not as a series of empty moments, but as a long wait she never realized was happening. That was when anger finally arrived. It didn't come loud or sharp. It came slow and steady, settling into her chest like a weight. She wasn't angry that the land was valuable. She wasn't even angry that he knew. She was angry that she had been living inside a life where the truth mattered, but not enough to be shared. She picked up her phone many times, put it down just as often. Some days she wrote messages she never sent. Other days she convinced herself there was nothing left to say. What would she ask him for? Money? Answers? A chance to rewrite the past? None of those things were possible. She talked to a lawyer once, more out of desperation than expectation. The meeting was short and careful. Papers were reviewed. Dates were checked. The conclusion was simple and final. She had no claim. She left on her own. She signed what she needed to sign. There was no trick, no lie she could prove, just silence and timing. She nodded, as if she had expected that answer all along. When she left the office, she didn't cry. She walked for a long time instead. Through streets she barely noticed. Past people who didn't know her story and didn't need to. The city felt louder that day. Every sound seemed to remind her that life went on whether she kept up with it or not. Far away, he watched the attention grow without reacting to it. He avoided interviews, declined offers to speak, let others handle what could be handled. He didn't celebrate. He didn't feel victorious. Sometimes late at night he thought about her, not in the way people imagine when they think of regret. He didn't wish she had stayed for the money. He wished she had stayed long enough to stop feeling alone, but wishing didn't change outcomes. It only made them heavier. He believed people made the best choices they could with what they knew at the time. She had chosen freedom. He had chosen patience. Neither choice was wrong. They were just incompatible. She saw his face on a screen once by accident. A brief image in the background of a news segment. He looked the same. Older, maybe. Calmer, she turned the screen off before the segment ended. That night she finally cried. Not for the money. Not even for him. She cried for the version of herself who thought leaving meant escaping loss. Without knowing, loss could follow quietly behind. When the tears stopped, something else took their place. Acceptance. Not the peaceful kind. The practical kind. She started making plans again. Small ones at first, then bigger ones. She stopped waiting for closure and focused on movement. Her life would not be extraordinary. It would not make headlines. But it would be hers fully, without secrets she had to guess at. And somewhere deep inside, she knew one truth she could finally trust. She had walked away from wealth, but she had walked toward herself. Years passed, not all at once, but quietly, the way time usually does when no one is counting. Her life settled into a shape that felt steady. Not exciting, not dramatic, but solid enough to stand on. She moved to a slightly bigger place after a while. Nothing fancy. just more light, a small balcony, and windows that faced the morning sun. She liked waking up with light instead of darkness. It reminded her that each day still arrived whether she was ready or not. She worked, saved, spent carefully. She learned how to trust her instincts again. At first, that part was hard. After everything, she questioned her choices more than she wanted to admit. But slowly, confidence returned. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that didn't need approval. Sometimes people asked her if she ever thought about the past. She usually smiled and said, "Of course." Then she changed the subject. Most people didn't really want the answer anyway. The truth was, she thought about it less than she used to. Not because it stopped mattering, but because it stopped controlling her. She heard updates now and then. News articles. Conversations overheard in passing. The land was no longer a mystery to anyone. Its value was known, talked about. Measured in numbers too large to feel real, he stayed mostly out of the public eye. That didn't surprise her. He had never liked attention. Money didn't change that. It only gave him more control over how quiet his life could remain. Once, long after everything had settled, she ran into someone who had worked near the property. The conversation was polite, brief, careful. "He still lives out there sometimes," the person said. "Not in the old way. But he visits." She nodded, as if she had expected that. That night, she dreamed of the cabin one last time. But it was different now. The walls didn't close in. The wind didn't sound angry. The place simply existed. It's like a chapter that had already been read and put back on the shelf. She woke up calm, across the distance. His life moved forward too. Quietly, purposefully. He invested carefully, gave privately, built things that wouldn't carry his name. Sometimes he wondered what would have happened if he had told her everything earlier. If honesty would have kept her there. If wealth shared might have softened the loneliness she felt. But those questions never stayed long. They didn't change anything. He believed people crossed paths to teach each other something, not to own each other forever. She had taught him that silence could cost more than words. He had taught her that choices made without full knowledge could still be honest. Years later, she stood on her balcony one evening, watching the sky turn soft and orange. The city moved below her, alive and unaware. She felt a deep sense of peace she hadn't known before. Her life wasn't extraordinary, but it was complete. She thought about how close she had come to staying in a place that made her feel small, even if it held something massive beneath it. She realized then that leaving wasn't her. Stake leaving without asking was. The story people told about the land focused on money, on timing, on value, but the real story was quieter. It was about how people choose with the information they have, and how those choices shape everything that comes after. She didn't lose a fortune. She gained clarity, and sometimes that was worth more than anything buried in the ground. Time changed how the story lived inside her. What once felt sharp slowly became something smoother, like a stone shaped by water. It was still there, still real, but it no longer cut her when she touched it. She noticed this one morning while making coffee. The sound of the machine, the smell in the air, the quiet of her kitchenette, all felt steady, ordinary. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't thinking about what might have been. She was thinking about what she needed to do next that day. That surprised her. For a long time, her thoughts had always drifted backward before they moved forward. Even when she was doing well, part of her stayed behind, replaying moments, checking decisions, measuring outcomes. Now, that part felt smaller. Not gone, but no longer in charge. She started volunteering on weekends. Something she had talked about doing for years, but never did. At first, it was just a way to fill time. Then it became something she looked forward to. Helping others had a way of putting her own past into perspective. Everyone carried something. Everyone had a story shaped by choices they made with limited information. She met people who had lost far more than money. People who had lost time, health, family, or chances that never came back. Listening to them didn't erase her own regret, but it changed how loud it sounded. One evening, after a long day, she walked home instead of taking the bus. The streets were busy. full of small moments happening all at once. A couple arguing softly, someone laughing into a phone, a child pulling at a parent's hand. Life was everywhere. She stopped at a crosswalk and waited for the light to change. As she stood there, she felt a strange sense of gratitude, not for the past, but for the present. For the fact that she was still moving, still learning, still capable of choosing differently. Far away, his days were quieter than people imagined. Wealth brought options, but it also brought distance. People approached him carefully, measuring every word. He learned quickly who was interested in him, and who was interested in what he had. He kept his circle small. Sometimes he returned to the land alone. The cabin was no longer the center of his life, but he kept it. Not out of nostalgia, but out of respect. It reminded him where patience had taken him, what it had cost. He walked the property often, hands in his pockets, breathing in the familiar air. He didn't think about the value beneath his feet. That part was handled, managed, calculated by others. What he thought about was quieter. He thought about how easily people misunderstood silence, how often it was seen as emptiness instead of intention. He wondered if he would choose differently if given the chance again. Not about the land, about the words he never spoke. Years had taught him that outcomes didn't always reflect intentions, and that knowing something valuable didn't mean knowing how to protect everyone involved. Back in the city, she received an unexpected message one afternoon. It wasn't from him. It was from someone who asked if she would be willing to speak about her experience privately, off the record. Just a conversation. She stared at the message for a long time. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She had spent years reclaiming her privacy. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger lately, wondered if speaking might finally close a door that had stayed open too long. She agreed. With conditions, the meeting was quiet. No cameras, no notes, just questions asked gently and answered honestly. She didn't talk about numbers. She talked about feelings, about waiting, about choosing without knowing. When it was over, she felt lighter, not because her story would change anything, but because she had finally told it in her own words, without anger or apology. That night, she slept deeply. She didn't expect the past to return in small, quiet ways. She thought it would come back loudly, if it came back at all. But instead, it appeared in moments she wasn't guarding herself against. It showed up when she passed a hardware store and remembered, buying tools she never learned how to use. It showed up when she smelled wood smoke on someone's jacket and felt her chest tighten for just a second before relaxing again. It showed up when she heard people talk about what could have been like. It was something easy to measure. Time had softened her, but it hadn't erased her memory one afternoon. While sorting through old things, she planned to donate. She found a notebook she hadn't opened in years. The pages were filled with lists, half-finished plans, and small notes she had written to herself during the cabin years. Most of them were simple. Reminders, hopes, questions. She never answered. She sat on the floor and read through every page. What surprised her wasn't the sadness. It was how hopeful she had been, even when she felt trapped. She had believed in effort, in patience, in the idea that staying meant something good would eventually come. She closed the notebook and smiled. Not with regret, but with understanding. That version of her had done the best she could with what she knew, and so had the version of her now later that week. She received another message from the same person who had spoken to her before. This time, they thanked her. Said her perspective mattered more than numbers ever could. Said it reminded them that stories weren't just about outcomes, but about the people who lived through the waiting. She didn't respond right away. Praise made her uncomfortable. She wasn't trying to be an example. She was just telling the truth as she knew it. Eventually, she replied with a short note. "I'm glad it helped. That was enough." Far away, his life had grown quieter in a different way. He no longer needed to prove anything. The work was done. The systems were in place. Others handled what once kept him awake at night yet. Peace didn't arrive all at once. Some evenings, he sat alone with a cup in his hands, staring out at nothing in particular. He thought about how easily people believed money solved uncertainty. In truth, it only changed its shape. He had gained freedom, yes. But he had also lost the simple honesty of a life, where nothing was hidden. He wondered sometimes if she had found what she was looking for. Not comfort, not wealth, but clarity. He never asked. Instead, he focused on doing what he could quietly, supporting causes that aligned with his values, helping without drawing attention. He believed that if something good came from what the land had given him, it should move outward, not inward. Back in the city, she felt a shift she hadn't expected. People began asking her advice, not about money, but about decisions, about leaving situations that didn't feel right, about trusting instincts even when the future wasn't clear. At first, she felt unqualified. Who was she to guide anyone else? Then she realized she wasn't giving answers. She was giving permission. Permission to choose without certainty. Permission to walk away without proof that something better was waiting. That felt right. One evening, she met someone new. Not in a dramatic way. Just a conversation that lasted longer than expected. Honest, easy, no guarded pauses, no careful silence. She noticed how different it felt to speak without weighing every word. When she walked home that night, she realized she wasn't afraid of building something again. She wasn't afraid of staying. She wasn't afraid of leaving. She was just present, and that was something she hadn't been in a very long time. Life did not change suddenly. It never did. It shifted in small, almost unnoticeable ways. The kind that only made sense when she looked back later. She began to feel lighter in conversations, not because she avoided the past, but because she no longer carried it like a warning sign. When people talked about mistakes or lost chances, she listened without feeling like they were talking about her. She learned that time didn't erase things. It organized them. Her days became fuller, not busier. She chose what mattered instead of filling space. Some evenings she stayed in, reading or listening to quiet music. Other nights she went out, not searching for anything, just open to connection. She noticed how different it felt to live without secrets in the room. The city became familiar in a new way. Not overwhelming, not exciting. Just steady. She found comfort in routines she had once avoided. Morning walks, grocery shopping on the same day each week, sitting in the same spot at a cafe and watching people pass without wondering where they were going. She was exactly where she needed to be. Every once in a while, she thought about the land again. Not with longing, more like curiosity. It was strange to know that something so valuable had once been part of her everyday life. Invisible and silent, she realized then how much of life worked that way. So many things existed beneath the surface, unnoticed until timing pulled them into the light. Across the distance, his world had slowed in ways money couldn't control. He had fewer obligations now, but more awareness. Wealth gave him choices, but it also stripped away excuses. He couldn't blame circumstance anymore, only himself. He spent more time alone than people expected. Not lonely time, intentional time. He reflected on the years before everything changed, on the patience that had carried him forward, and the cost of that patience to someone else. He accepted that silence had protected the land, but not the relationship. That understanding stayed with him. One afternoon, he stood at the edge of the property, watching the wind move through the trees. The cabin stood behind him, unchanged on the outside. Inside, it had been stripped of anything unnecessary. Clean, simple, quiet. He didn't feel attachment to it anymore. Just respect. Back in the city, she received a letter she didn't expect. No return address. No explanation on the envelope. Inside, there were only a few lines. No apology. No defense. Just acknowledgement. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It didn't ask for anything at all. She read it once. Then again, she felt no rush of emotion. Just clarity. Some things didn't need answers. Some truths didn't need agreement. They only needed to be seen. She placed the letter in a drawer and closed it gently. That night, she slept without dreams. She began to understand that peace was not the absence of memory. But the ability to hold memory without letting it decide her future, that realization didn't arrive in a dramatic moment. It came quietly on an ordinary day. While she was doing something simple, she was washing dishes, staring out the window. When it hit her that she hadn't thought about the land or the cabin in days, not because she was avoiding the thought, but because it simply hadn't come. Her mind had been busy with other things. Real things. Present things. She turned off the water and stood there for a moment, letting that sink in. It felt like progress. Her life had grown fuller in ways that didn't show up on paper. She had people she trusted now. Not many, but enough. Conversations that didn't feel like careful steps across thin ice. Laughter that didn't end with silence afterward. She learned how to say what she needed without apologizing for it. That was new. It felt awkward at first, like using a muscle she had never trained. But the more she did it, the easier it became. One evening, while walking home, she stopped at a small park. She passed often, but rarely entered. She sat on a bench and watched the sky darken slowly. Lights came on one by one. Somewhere nearby, someone played music softly. She thought about how much of her life had once been spent waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for reassurance. Waiting for something to finally make sense now. She waited for nothing. Across the distance, his days followed a different rhythm. The world around him moved quickly, but he stayed slow on purpose. He had learned that rushing only created noise, and he had enough of that early on. He spent time reading, walking, thinking. Things he once told himself he would do later had arrived quietly, without asking permission. He reflected often on the choices that had brought him here. Not with regret, but with honesty. He knew now that secrecy, even when meant to protect, could still harm. Silence could keep value hidden, but it could also keep people apart. He accepted that truth fully. Once, while reviewing old documents, he came across something written in his own hand years ago. A note about patience, about waiting until the right moment, about how timing mattered more than emotion. He stared at the words for a long time. They were still true, but they were incomplete. Timing mattered, yes, but so did trust. He closed the folder and put it away, no longer needing the reminder. Back in the city, she was invited to speak at a small gathering. Not publicly. Just a room full of people sharing experiences about change and choice. She hesitated before agreeing. She didn't like being seen as someone with answers, but when she stood there and spoke, she didn't offer advice. She told a story. Her story, simply, honestly. She talked about leaving without knowing everything, about how freedom could feel like loss before it felt like relief, about how value didn't always look the way people expected. When she finished, the room was quiet. Not uncomfortable, respectful. Afterward, someone thanked her. Another person said they felt less alone, that stayed with her longer than anything else. Later that night, sat by her window, city lights stretching out below. She realized she no longer defined herself by what she had walked away from. She defined herself by what she had learned to carry forward, and that felt like enough. The end of a story rarely feels like an ending while it's happening. Most of the time, it feels like another ordinary day, quietly different from the ones before it. She noticed this on a morning that began like any other. The light came through the window at the same angle it always did. The street below sounded the same. She made her coffee, stood by the counter, and took the first sip without rushing. Nothing dramatic. It's happened. And that was the point. Her life no longer felt like it was waiting for something else to start. It was already in motion, steady and balanced. She didn't measure her days by what they might lead to. She measured them by how they felt while she was living them. She had learned that peace didn't arrive with certainty. It arrived with acceptance. She thought back to the person she had been when she first stepped away from the cabin. That version of her believed leaving meant losing. She didn't yet understand that staying without truth was its own kind of loss. Now, she did. She had built a life that fit her. Not perfectly, but honestly. She made choices without over-explaining them. She trusted herself, enough to know when something felt right and when it didn't. That trust had been the hardest thing to rebuild. Sometimes people still brought up the story. They spoke about it in whispers, as if money alone made it fragile. She listened without reacting. It no longer felt like her story belonged to anyone else. It belonged to her because she lived it far away. Life had settled into something quiet and intentional. The attention had faded, as attention always did. What remained was routine, reflection, responsibility. He had come to understand that wealth didn't give answers. It only gave space. What he did with that space mattered more than anything else. He spent time on the land less often now. Not because it had lost meaning, but because its role in his life had changed. It had given what it could give. The rest was up to him. He had learned that waiting protected value, but openness protected connection. That lesson stayed with him. There were moments when he thought about reaching out. Not to explain, not to fix, but simply to acknowledge. Each time he decided against it. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Some connections were meant to end cleanly, without reopening old doors. Back in the city, she stood on her balcony one evening, watching the sky change color. She thought about how many versions of herself had existed over the years. The hopeful one, the patient one, the tired one, the brave one who finally walked away. All of them had led her here. She didn't regret leaving. She regretted not asking more questions. But regret no longer controlled her. It informed her. She understood now that value wasn't always buried in land. Sometimes it was buried in timing, in honesty, in the courage to choose without guarantees. Her life wasn't extraordinary by the world's standards, but it was rich in the ways that mattered to her. She went inside as night settled, closing the door gently behind her. Not because she was afraid of what was outside, but because she knew exactly where she belonged, and somewhere far from the city, beneath quiet trees and steady ground. The land remained what it had always been, valuable, but no longer the most important thing.